Good afternoon. If I could have your attention for just a moment, please. I know that you're all having lovely lunchtime conversations, but I must interrupt you. I want to tell you that Joel Quinville will be here shortly. I'm kidding, but I knew that would make the room quiet. Tomorrow at the Illinois Policy Institute, the entire staff will be showing up in their Blackhawks gear. And it turns out we're going to have some guests from Bulgaria, so I was trying to explain why that is, and it was all a little confusing last night at a dinner I was at. My name's John Tillman. I'm the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. I just wanted to briefly say thanks to all of you for being here for this important debate. And since all of you have already supposedly, or I assume rather, voted, and I do believe that 2 minutes have gone by and you are locked in, I would just like to say that my money's on Jacob Hubert. That was, you know, where's your opponent, Jacob? He's here somewhere. Oh, you're right there. There you are, sitting right next to me. I couldn't see you. Although I must say that you have had several people come up to you and giving you very fine words of encouragement, and you have advocates in the room, so I think the room will be very balanced in its point of view. For those of you who are here who had friends who want to be here, you can text them now and let them know that CAN TV is carrying this live. And if they want to, they can watch that now on their cable system, CAN TV 27. And they can go, of course, later on to cantv.org to watch this. If you have so much fun and you want to see it a second time, cantv.org for you. And then finally, I would just like to say thank you so much to the Union League Club, and especially David Cohn, who will be up here in a moment, who does just an amazing job in running the Public Affairs Committee of the Union League Club. Really the best in the country, I believe. I've been to many clubs all over the country. They usually try to block me at the front door, so I go in the side door, but I do get in. And normally, most of those clubs have nothing on par with what our great Union League Club does. I've been a member for many years, and it is just an enriching place with all points of view well represented. And David, you are really the leader of making that happen, and have been doing it so well for a very long time. So on behalf of all of us engaged in civic affairs in the city of Chicago, thank you for doing that. So a round of applause for David and the Union League Club. And now I happily turn over the podium to Chris Roebling, who will be your moderator, and I will resume my seat as a friendly heckler. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant David Cohn.
John, thank you very much for those gracious comments. We are delighted to welcome everyone here to the Union League Club of Chicago on behalf of the officers, directors, and members of the club. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging two of our senior officers who are with us today. Our first Vice President, Mr. Terry Hendrickson. Mr. Hendrickson, thank you. And our second Vice President, Mr. William Nissen. Mr. Nissen. And Mr. Nissen concurrently chairs the Public Affairs Committee this year. As John mentioned, we are delighted to be partnering with the Illinois Policy Institute. We want to thank the Illinois Policy Institute for not only bringing us this substantive program, but for graciously providing luncheon service for all of us today. So thank you very much, John. We really appreciate that. And since this is an Oxford-style debate, Mr. Roebling is actually our chairman, and he will be engaging our two presenters today in discussion of the motion before us. Resolved, any United States city that wishes to have an NHL franchise must endure winter. Thank you. No, in all seriousness, we appreciate the opportunity to gather today in the greatest tradition of Western democracy in our democratic republic to reason together and to discuss this important question by hearing from these two gentlemen who will argue for and against the motion before us. Briefly, I just wanted to mention that the reason the Union League Club is involved in such matters goes back to our founding. This is the only private club in the United States with an institutional commitment to public policy and civic affairs. And the reason for that is that this club was founded by citizen patriots who during the Civil War formed an organization that was called the Union Leagues of America. It was formed in 1862 during the height of the Civil War to assist President Lincoln in defense of the Union. That's where the Union and the Union League Club name comes from. And this wonderful portrait above the mantelpiece that you see, Patria, which is emblematic of our devotion to country, alludes quite directly to our faith in the Union and the importance of affiliating ourselves with those who believe in democracy and involvement by citizens thereof. And it is in that context that we gather here today. We have a full-time public affairs committee that works on public policy issues, and we are delighted to partner with the Illinois Policy Institute and all of our civic affairs partners to talk about the issues that matter to us as citizens of this great nation. In keeping with our tradition here at the club, before I turn it over to our chairman, Mr. Roebling, can I ask you to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the chairman of today's debate and a senior counsel of our Public Affairs Committee, Mr. Chris Roebling.
Thank you. All right. We've got terrific folks up here today for and against the motion. For the motion, David Melton is Executive Director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. He was elected to the board of directors of that organization in May, but then he resigned that position in July of 2013 to assume the duties of executive director. Melton was an attorney in private practice, both with the Chicago firm Mayer Brown and the Milwaukee firm Foley and Lardner, and has extensive experience in intellectual property matters, and was part of the pro bono team of attorneys that sued the state of Illinois to compel compliance with federal statutes relating to what we call motor voter, the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act. Former board member, including a term as president of the board of the Chicago Council of Lawyers, please welcome David Melton. David, please come on up. And take your seat over here. Against the motion, Jacob Hubert Jacob is a University of Chicago graduate, University of Chicago Law School graduate. He is a senior attorney at the Liberty Justice Center, the Illinois Policy Institute. He litigates cases to protect economic liberty, the First Amendment, and other constitutional rights in both federal and state forums. In his First Amendment practice, Jacob and the Liberty Justice Center are challenging the state of Illinois campaign finance law, which in their opinion restricts campaign contributions for all but a privileged few in Illinois. Jacob received his bachelor's from Grove City College, and like I say, his JD from the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Deborah Cook of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, just one east of here, over in Columbus, Detroit, Cincinnati, places like that. And then he had his own law office in Ohio before coming out to Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for Jacob Hubert, please. Now, we've got 3 chairs there. There will be a little walking around, but let's do it this way. For the opening affirmative and negative, pro and contra, I'm going to ask the advocate to come up here to the lectern, and then I'll switch places with you. I'll come back up here, and then we'll do the rebuttals. How's that sound? Okay. All right, so this being a motion that is going to be supported by David Melton. David Melton, I'm going to read the motion one more time so everybody has it in mind. Nonprofit organizations influencing government and engaging in political advocacy, including issue advertising, should be required to disclose their donors. For the motion, David Melton.
Thank you, Chris. And just before I begin, let me thank the IPI for setting this debate up. We at ICPR always appreciate the opportunity to come and address audiences, whatever their political persuasion. We're bipartisan. And we look forward to an opportunity to try and convince you. So thanks to Chris and to IPI and to all of you for coming today. Why is it appropriate to require those trying to exert substantial influence on our government or our elected representatives to disclose their true identities? Well, this is not a hard issue. In fact, courts throughout our country's history have repeatedly said there are at least 3 fundamental reasons why government can require that the true identity of the donors or those seeking to influence the political process have to be disclosed. The first and the most important reason that we require the true identity of donors, substantial donors, to be disclosed is to provide voters with the necessary information about the source of those comments so that they can evaluate the credibility of those comments. Who is speaking can make a significant difference on the credibility of an argument. If we see an ad telling us that smoking is healthy, it helps to know whether that ad is financed by medical researchers or by the tobacco industry. Voters are entitled to that same type of information when they go to the polls and have to decide between competing policy proposals being urged by some of the most powerful and richest members of our society. Second fundamental reason that we require the disclosure of the true identities of people seeking to buy influence with our government is to prevent corruption. And we have a long history that we can draw on here. Human history has repeatedly demonstrated that power corrupts and that money corrupts. And within our own United States history, we have repeatedly found that there is a danger of corruption. That is why the founders of our nation put a clause in the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, prohibiting government officials from accepting gifts or other benefits from the leaders of foreign nations without disclosure to and the consent of Congress. That is why we adopted the initial campaign finance reforms at the turn of the century, including the Tillman Act prohibiting corporate contributions to political campaigns. That is why, in the wake of the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s, we strengthened those disclosure requirements under the federal laws. And that is why we strengthened those requirements, those disclosure requirements again in the 1970s, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, which, for those of you who are old enough to remember it, may recall that the plumbers who were engaged in the bugging operation were paid out of a secret slush fund maintained by the Nixon re-election campaign. So prevention of corruption is the second important reason that we require disclosure of the true identities of those seeking to influence our government. The third, and I would just say that here I want to remember and pay tribute to the important observation that Justice Brandeis made. In a democracy, sunlight is the best disinfectant to prevent this type of scourge. That has proved true repeatedly throughout our history. The third fundamental reason we permit government to require disclosure of the true identity of donors is so that government can police the existing campaign finance restrictions. You cannot prevent or police those things that you do not know about that go on in secret. So that is the third fundamental reason we require disclosure of the true identities of donors. Now, it is true that there are some exceptions to these disclosure requirements. One exception is there's a de minimis exception, so that when we're talking about someone who engages in a small act not likely to have substantial influence on the political process, such as the act of signing a petition or the act of making a very small contribution to a political candidate, those people are often exempted from the disclosure requirement because we recognize that they do not pose a serious risk of affecting the debate or corrupting the process. There is a second exception, which I expect Jacob will mention here today, and it arises under what we call the NAACP versus Alabama case. This is an exception in which the court found that in 1956 in Alabama, the NAACP did not have to disclose its membership list to the state government of Alabama, which was seeking that list in order for the purpose of basically suppressing the rising civil rights movement. Now, that is a legitimate exception to disclosure requirements, but it is a false symmetry to say that it has anything to do with what we are talking about here today. The reason it is false symmetry has several components. First, the people who are contributing to our campaigns today, who are making significant contributions, substantial contributions, more than de minimis, they are some of the wealthiest and most powerful members of our society. For instance, in the 2010 congressional elections, 60% of the money contributed to political campaigns came from approximately 100 individuals in this country. Now, when those 100 individuals spend substantial amounts of money trying to influence our government and tell us how the rest of the 350 million of us should govern ourselves, we're entitled to know their identities. That is a price of admission to the public debate. The second reason that this situation is nothing like the NAACP versus Alabama case is that in the NAACP versus Alabama, the state government was actually one of the bad guys. It was trying to suppress speech. It was trying to entirely cut off public debate about the civil rights movement. And when there's a risk that because of threats of harassment and intimidation, that one entire set of speakers will be cut off, in that situation, it is appropriate for the state to provide appropriate protection to protect their right to speak. So that is the second reason why the NAACP versus Alabama case does not apply here. I would close by pointing out a quote from Justice Scalia in a recent case, Doe versus Reed. He said, "There are laws against threats and intimidation and harsh criticism. There are laws against threats and intimidation. But harsh criticism, short of unlawful action, is a price our people traditionally have been willing to pay for self-governance. Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. For my part, I do not look forward to a society which, thanks to the Supreme Court, campaigns anonymously and even exercises the direct democracy of initiative and referendum hidden from public scrutiny and protected from the accountability of criticism. That does not resemble the home of the brave." Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Thanks very much. And now, our opening negative from Jacob Hubert.
The question in this debate is whether people who donate to nonprofit organizations that engage in political advocacy or try to influence government should have their names and information reported to the government and listed publicly online. And the answer is they shouldn't. Forcing individuals to forcing nonprofits to give the government their donors' information would violate individuals' right to privacy, chill free speech and free association, reduce competition in the marketplace for political ideas, and help entrench the political status quo. When we talk about people who give to nonprofit organizations that engage in advocacy on issues or try to influence government, we could be talking about people giving to churches that tell their members where they should stand on issues. We could be talking about people giving to their local animal shelter that takes a position on an issue related to animal welfare. So forcing people to make information about their giving public is a serious invasion of personal privacy that can affect everyone, from ordinary people who just want to support their church or a local charity, to people who are more engaged in trying to influence the public debate on cutting-edge issues. Just think of the pressure that an ordinary person could feel when their church finds out that they gave more money to a particular charity than to the church that year, or when their university finds out how much they're giving to other causes, or when their neighbors find out who they're giving money to and how much. This is information that has always been private. You have always had the right to choose who knows that information about you, and rightly so. Think about someone applying for a job. Should an employer be able to see every organization they've given money to and possibly discriminate against them based on their political views? A lot of people, when they apply for a job, try to make sure that their political and religious leanings aren't apparent on their resume. They try to clean up their Facebook and Twitter accounts to make sure there isn't political stuff there that might turn their employer off. If people are forced to report their contributions, protecting your privacy like that will no longer be an option. Your only option to protect your privacy will be to not give money to the causes that you believe in. The consequences for people who want to support controversial causes can be even more severe, As Mr. Melton mentioned, in the 1950s, the state of Alabama tried to force the NAACP to reveal the names and addresses of its members. And of course, if you were a white person in that time and place who supported the NAACP, you could be subject, and your neighbors found out, you could be subject to harassment, intimidation, violence. You could be subject to a boycott if you owned a business. And the government knew this, and that's why it wanted to force disclosure. Fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state couldn't force the NAACP to reveal its members because it would prevent those people from exercising their right to freely associate, to advocate their beliefs. Now, Mr. Melton suggests that situation is different, and well, if that's your situation where you would face that kind of harassment, well, then you could go to the court and they could give you an exception to the general rule where you don't have to disclose your donors. But who's going to do that? Who is able to do that? Who has the resources to not only support an organization, but also to go to court, to file a lawsuit, to protect their privacy in advance, especially when they may want to make the donation in a short term, when they want to get out a message that could have an impact? That is not a fair or reasonable burden to place on people who want to engage in public debate. And by the way, you may not even know whether you're going to face retaliation or harassment in advance. In California, not long ago, there was a woman who gave a $100 contribution to the campaign in support of Proposition 8 in that state. Her name was Margie Christopherson. She was a restaurant manager. And under that state's disclosure laws, her disclosure was reported to the government, and it was made public. And then she faced personal harassment. People boycotted the restaurant where she worked, and she had to quit her job so that the restaurant wouldn't go out of business or have its business suffer very badly. And so I'm sure before she made that contribution, she had no idea it was going to subject her to that. And if she had known, she wouldn't have made the contribution. She wouldn't have gone to a court and filed a lawsuit and gone through everything necessary to make sure she could make her $100 contribution. She just wouldn't have made it. Now, what would happen if the government made donations to any cause public? Would a person who works in a union shop feel comfortable giving a donation to an organization that supports right-to-work laws? Would a person who lives in a conservative community feel comfortable giving a donation to an organization that supports same-sex marriage? Well, the answers to these questions are obvious. Some people would, but forced government reporting would have a chilling effect. It would cause many people to not contribute to causes at all, rather than have evidence of their personal beliefs permanently available for the entire world to see. And if people become afraid to give money to organizations that engage in advocacy on important issues, that means there will be less speech on those issues. Organizations will have less resources to put those ideas in front of the public. And it means in particular that new and controversial ideas will be at a disadvantage in the marketplace of ideas. Because after all, people who support dominant popular opinions don't have that much to worry about if the fact that they support those opinions gets out in front of the public. It's generally the people who are challenging the status quo, people like those members of the NAACP during the Civil Rights Movement who have to be concerned about harassment and retaliation for their views. That means that forced disclosure protects the existing political establishment and helps make sure that the status quo remains in place. It stifles the vibrant marketplace of ideas that the First Amendment exists to protect. We let people vote in private because we want people to vote their conscience without being afraid of intimidation or bullied into voting for someone they don't want to vote for. Private giving serves that same purpose. Protecting people's right to give money to causes privately gives ordinary people a way to participate in the public debate without worrying about what their neighbors think, whether it will hurt them when they apply for a job, or whether it will expose them to even more serious retaliation. Private giving encourages diversity of opinion, it encourages challenges to the status quo, and therefore it's an inherently good thing, and it should be protected.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jacob. I hope you're all thinking about your portion of the program. Your portion of the program begins in about 10, 12 minutes because we'll be taking some questions from you. And so please think of those. Please probably want to write those down, get them really concise so that we can get through as many as possible. Right now, one of the great reasons for doing a structured debate is so that the proponents can actually investigate each other's position. And to do that, we're now going to go to our first affirmative rebuttal. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Jacob, I'm delighted to hear that you're concerned about the privacy of citizens, and I would welcome you to join me at the civil liberties meetings of the Chicago Council of Lawyers that we hold monthly. But your argument is based upon a number of false premises. And the first one is that that's what we're really talking about here is the privacy interest of ordinary citizens making small or de minimis contributions. We are not. As I noted in my opening, most disclosure statutes have cutoffs below which the individual information about donors does not need to be disclosed. So we are not talking about the small person deciding to make a contribution. We're talking about some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in this country who contribute to the majority of the money to political campaigns and try to buy candidates and buy government influence through the that we will unduly invade the privacy of individuals is simply wrong. Moreover, for the reasons that Justice Scalia pointed out, it is bad public policy in a democracy. In a democracy, there is a price to be paid for participating in the public debate, and that is you have to be willing to take criticism of your position. That's not to say you have to be willing to endure the bombing of your house, the lynching of your people, or your murder, but you do have to be willing to endure criticism. That's the price of participating in a public debate, and that is why your true identity needs to be disclosed in the course of that debate. Now, there are some other false premises in your argument. Let me just take some of them and address them. First, the argument that you make was rejected by no less a conservative authority than 8 members of the Supreme Court in the famous Citizens United case, where they upheld the constitutionality of disclosure requirements in this context for precisely the reasons I've outlined in my opening. What we're really talking about here is essentially the Wizard of Oz scenario. When those of us in the ordinary public, the Dorothys, the Tinmans, the Cowardly Lions, and the Scarecrows, go to seek advice from the Wizard of Oz, are they entitled to know the true identity of the man behind the curtain? I say yes, because if that man is going to tell them to go out and risk their own lives in battling evil witches, then they're entitled to know that that man is not truly a wizard, the charlatan who was badly blown off course. Now, that is a fundamental aspect, as I said earlier, of our democracy. Invoking the NAACP comparison, as I said in my opening, that's a false symmetry, because people here involved in these debates do not face lynchings, they do not face their homes being bombed, or anything like what people in 1956 Alabama faced. And I would just note, it was not mostly the white supporters of the NAACP that faced those dangers in 1956. Your final argument is it will discourage giving to charitable institutions. Well, that's also based on a false premise, because you see, in order to obtain a designation under the federal tax code as a charitable institution, you have to agree not to engage in partisan political politics. So we're not going to discourage givings to charities or churches or other organizations such as that. We will require that if you're a substantial contributor to an advocacy organization seeking to have an influence on public policy, yes, then your identity does need to be disclosed. And you're not entitled to take advantage of some of the loopholes that the lawyers have created under the existing tax code for 501c4 and 501c6 organizations. Will that discourage some giving? I do not think there is a serious risk that it will discourage enough giving to pass the hurdle of the NAACP case, which is that we would cut off all participation by the richest and most powerful members of our society in those political debates.
Thank you, David. Jacob.
We should be clear here that we're not talking about donations to organizations that coordinate with candidates or do things directly for or against candidates. We're talking about donations to nonprofit organizations of all kinds that do advocacy on the issues. And in the course of talking about issues, they may, of course, tell people where their legislators stand, but that's the most important sort of political speech. And it's not an inherently corrupting kind of speech, and it's not the kind of speech that buys candidates. Surely if people are interested in directly buying a candidate, they would have other ways to do that besides giving money privately to nonprofit organizations that in many cases don't talk about candidates at all. That just doesn't make sense. That sweeps way too broadly and stifles potentially lots of speech that has nothing to do with the election of candidates. The idea that voters need information on who is funding the speech they hear doesn't really hold up. Sometimes it's beneficial to not know who is doing the speaking so you can focus on the message. The people who authored the Federalist Papers, after all, kept their names off of those papers because they didn't want people to be prejudiced against their message because of who they were and where they were from. They wanted people to focus on the merits of the Constitution instead, and that worked for them. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a good thing. So much political discourse today, after all, focuses on who's the messenger. It focuses on personal attacks. It focuses on personalities. People are perfectly capable of evaluating ideas on their own merits. And if they do think it's important to know who's behind a message they're receiving, they can always say, I'm not going to support this idea unless I know who's behind it. But otherwise, that's up to them to choose. They can choose how much value to place on that. It's not the government's place to make that decision for them. And in fact, the Supreme Court has recognized in McIntyre versus Ohio Board of Elections, for example, that people generally get to decide for themselves what information they will provide to the government. If the government thinks it's important for people to know who's behind a message, that's not a good enough reason to force people to tell that. People historically, under the First Amendment, get to decide what they will say, and people can evaluate it accordingly. They can't lie about who they are, but if they don't want to say who they are, that's their business, and people can make of that what they will. And by the way, the idea that this kind of money given to nonprofit organizations is a huge factor in elections that's really making a big difference is pretty dubious, because in 2012, in the 2012 election across the country, spending from nonprofit organizations that don't disclose their donors accounted for less than 5% of all spending in that election. And in the 2014 election cycle, spending by those kinds of groups that don't disclose their donors constituted only about 3.7% of all spending in that election cycle. So the idea here that there's some big problem with money flooding into elections from unknown sources is simply not true, and it doesn't justify violating the privacy and associational rights of every kind of group that wants to advocate on the issues. And again, a lot of that spending that we just talked about, that 5%, that 3.7%, it's not even it's not spending on vote for or against this person. A lot of it pertains to the issues. So this is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, that unnecessarily violates people's rights. Oh, another fact, by the way, in the 2012 election, there were only 28 nonprofit groups across the entire country that that don't disclose their donors and spent more than $1 million.
Let's leave it right there. Let's leave it right there. Now we've got our second rebuttals, and back to David.
Thank you, Chris. Jacob, I appreciate your arguments, but again, you've got your premises and some of your facts wrong. The fact is that super PACs were not authorized at all by the courts until approximately 2010, and that it took lawyers a couple years until 2012 to discover this loophole or create this loophole about super PACs that could not only take unlimited contributions, but did not have to disclose the identity of their donors. Since then, the amount of money going into these undisclosed super PACs has risen dramatically, and it is currently estimated that as much as 50% of the money spent in the next presidential election may come from undisclosed donors. That is not a healthy situation for our democracy. Moreover, your argument about the court recognizing the right to anonymous speech, in fact, the Supreme Court has never recognized that there is a constitutional right to engage in anonymous speech. In fact, the most conservative courts, including the Citizens United majority and the D.C. Circuit in the case of Speech Now, which authorized the creation of these independent super PACs, said the following: the public has an interest in knowing who is speaking about a candidate and who is funding that speech, no matter whether the contributions were made towards administrative expenses or independent expenditures. Further, requiring disclosure of such information deters and helps expose violations of the campaign finance restrictions, such as those barring contributions from foreign corporations or individuals. These are sufficiently important government interests to justify requiring Speech Now to organize and report to the FEC as a political committee. Now, your other point about the Federalist Papers, the fact of the matter is, and I will here cite to the William and Mary Quarterly, an article that appeared on the authorship of disputed Federalist Papers by Douglas Adair. The authors of the Federalist Papers were in fact well known at the time those papers were written. It was known that it was the three individuals, Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson. That was known at the time. It was no secret. So the argument that that's an example of anonymous speech being allowed is really misplaced. Finally, I would say that many conservatives recognize that disclosure is appropriate. And I'll just quote from an article in the American Spectator by Matt Cover, entitled "Is Donor Disclosure Good for the Right?" And he says, and I'm just going to quote this portion of it, "The case for knowing when and from whom large sums are given to politicians is simply self-evident." I think I will leave it there.
Jacob.
I'm going to finish my previous thought that I left off on. In 2012, nationwide, there were only 28 nonprofit groups across the country that don't disclose their donors that spent more than $1 million on all of their advertising across the entire country. And most of those organizations were were organizations that everyone knows about: Planned Parenthood, the National Rifle Association, the Humane Society. You may not know who gives to those organizations, but you know what those organizations stand for. You know where they're coming from. There's no good reason to know who exactly is giving them their money. The only thing that does is violate the privacy of the people who choose to support those donations. And yes, maybe a wealthy person who wants to give money to Planned Parenthood, say, they should have the right to privacy protected just like everybody else. Your rights don't end, and your ability to exercise them, when you make a certain amount of money. Your rights are your rights, and we shouldn't be discriminating against people who want to give a lot of support to the causes that they believe in. Other groups that are in that category of those 28 nonprofit groups that spend that much may not disclose their donors, but you can have a pretty good sense of who they are. For example, if Karl Rove controls an organization that makes donations, well, you might not know who contributes to that, but you know Karl Rove's in charge of it, so you can have a pretty good sense of it. And there are other organizations. You know, there's organizations that people identify with the Koch brothers, and even though they don't break down all the money that goes in, people have a sense of who gives money to that, or who George Soros gives money to. It's really, a lot of this stuff is kind of an open secret when you talk about these wealthy people. The real risk comes when you have people who are not Koch-level wealthy, let's say, who want to give substantial sums, which may be a significant expense to them because it's something they believe in. And these people, if they want to maintain their privacy, should have that privacy respected. I think we could go on to questions.
Very good. Let's hear it for our disputants. So this part is questions, and am I getting these questions written down? Have we David? Oh, we've got microphones. Okay, so, all right, now let me tell you how this is going to work. We've got nice people here with microphones who are going to come to you, and you're going to stand up, and you're not going to hold on to that microphone. You're going to say your name, and you're going to give us a very concise question. and the speeches are made by the people who are sitting up here. Does everybody understand what I am saying? Thank you. All right. Come on. Let's have a show of hands. We'll start with John Tillman. And while our folks are coming in with the microphones, you can go ahead and identify somebody up there. I want to also recognize the chairman of the Illinois Committee Campaign for Political Reform, former State Senator Susan Garrett from Lake Forest. She is the chairman of the campaign. Please stand up and say hi to everybody. Back when it was snowing outside, Susan and I and Christina Rasmussen from IPI were talking about this program, and we're glad you're all here. All right, please identify yourself.
You already did. John Tillman, Illinois Policy Institute.
Let's turn the microphone on.
Perhaps that's a good one.
I can give you mine.
David, you have cited Scalia, you have cited Citizens United, both of those, and you referred to your last quote as a giving to the conservative, giving to politicians. This debate is not about electioneering money, nor is it about Citizens United or Scalia's quote that you use. Those are all about giving to elections, not nonprofits that do issue advocacy. Could you address that? And after that,
Yes, your premise is wrong. Your premise is wrong, John. They actually, those quotes all address independent giving to the types of organizations that we're talking about here today, so long as those organizations are engaged in political activities. Now, if those organizations do not want to disclose their full donor list, that's fine. All they have to do is segregate their political activities from their non-political activities and require only that the donors to the political side of the organization be disclosed. But you're wrong that those quotes do not concern. They do concern independent expenditures of the types made by organizations that we're talking about here today.
Jacob.
For any participation in political debate, electioneering or contributing to political candidates, anything intended to substantially move the public debate on issues of public importance.
Well, that's a pretty broad reading right there. Move the public debate on issues of importance? We want to shut that down. We want to discourage that. We want to force everybody to disclose who they are when they speak on anything of public importance. The enemies of free speech and open political debate, when they put campaign finance laws in place, they said we needed to do it to limit corruption, like bribes, but now we're trying to control who's speaking on issues of importance? That seems a lot broader. Now, if you want to narrow it down, if you want to tell me that when I just talk about issues of public policy, that you don't want to limit, you don't want to force disclosure of that, that would be good to hear. If you want to say that you don't want to force disclosure of people who talk about where elected officials stand on issues and inform people of what they should think about that apart from an election, that would be good to hear. Are you saying that you only support this sort of disclosure in the context where you're actually supporting a candidate for office in the context of an election? Or does it sweep as broadly? Because certainly the resolution here sweeps much more broadly than that.
Yes, and to answer that, I am saying it's more broad than that. The courts say it's more broad than that, and common sense says it's more broad than that. When you are trying to make a substantial argument that has the chance of seriously moving public debate in one direction, under our system of self-governance, you should have to disclose what your identity is, and so that the public can evaluate what your motives and what your truthfulness is. For the same reason that Dorothy and the Scarecrow and the Lion and the Tin Man were entitled to know that the man behind the curtain pulling the levers of power was not really a wizard, but was in fact a charlatan.
Next question. Are you guys going around and who's ready for a next? Go. Yeah. Please stand. Be ready to go.
Bob Fitzgerald.
You gotta be ready to go.
The CEO of Mozilla lost his job over a $1,000 contribution to a ballot issue, advocating it. And I just wonder whether you think that's appropriate, or should we not have CEOs make contributions on those issues?
I would say the CEO there made a decision to resign. He did not have to resign. He could have stayed in the public arena, which he chose to enter by making that contribution, that $1,000 contribution. So I do not have a great deal of sympathy for that situation. But if you're saying that that's a de minimis contribution that he shouldn't put his job at risk over, then he can contribute within the limits that wouldn't require disclosure, which are generally under $200 in most states and under the federal system.
Well, let's be clear about that. So where is this line of de minimis? Is it $200? So the $1,000 should expose him to whatever retaliation the public wants to wage against him for supporting a cause he believes in?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Jacob. It's really a matter of states' rights, which I would think would resonate with you. The state governments that control us and that govern us are entitled to set that limit and define that line.
Well, states' rights are one thing, but I don't necessarily know that the government of Illinois knows best about how much I should be allowed to give to the causes I believe in without giving that information to my employer and my neighbors and everybody else who might be interested in it.
Well, the limits on the legislature's action are set by the courts under the Constitution. So if the legislature goes too far, the courts can rein them in. But I think under our system of self-governance, that's the appropriate place for that line to be drawn, the place for that line to be drawn in the first instance.
Next question, and I want to say to our nice, friendly microphone people, you can select the person who's going to speak. Just get them stood up and get them ready to go so that we just go right to you. Okay, right here.
My name is Dennis Canfield. Dave, in your opening statement, you said that the second reason for requiring disclosure is to prevent corruption. Could you please explain exactly what you mean by corruption, give us a definition, and then explain how disclosure would reduce corruption?
Okay. One easy definition that everyone on all sides of the political debate agrees on is what's called quid pro quo corruption, namely bribing legislatures to get their votes in support of your public policy or in your support of your private company or personal interest. That, we all agree, is prohibited, and that's one form of corruption that these disclosure requirements are intended to prevent, and they have been consistently used for that purpose over the last 150 years in this country. And they've been consistently adopted both by Congress and by state legislatures around the country. A second type of corruption is broader and is subject to more argument, both in the courts and in the legislatures. And that's when you get outside the quid pro quo corruption, and it refers to what we call corruption of the government's interest. This is when the representatives start paying more attention to their rich donors than to the desires of their actual voters. Their loyalty, their main loyalty should be to their voters, not simply to their richest donors. And that's a different form of corruption, a broader form of corruption that these kinds of disclosure requirements are also intended to prevent and address.
Natalie?
Jacob, any reaction to that?
We can keep moving for now.
All right, let's right out here. Yes, sir.
Right.
Right.
Oh, I can't hold it. My name is Tom Rosenwein, and I had a question for the panelists. I can go to the FEC website and see what people whose names I know have contributed to various candidates, and that's been in effect for many years, and see the amounts that have been given. What is the difference here between that kind of disclosure and the disclosure we're talking about with regard to organizations that are involved in issue advocacy?
Jacob.
When you talk about contributions to candidates, there's more of an argument there for disclosure, because people who are running for office are sort of like job applicants. They have to tell us certain things about themselves. They have to show us that they meet qualifications for office. And one thing that we make as a qualification for office is that they tell us who's giving them money. And so there's an argument there that is reasonable, given that these people are applying to us for a job, and there is, of course, at least some arguable there is the possibility for corruption, where when someone is giving money directly to a legislator or other candidate for office, that they might be doing so in exchange for a favor. So there's a little bit of an argument there. But that argument doesn't apply when we're talking about giving to nonprofits, because nonprofits are private organizations. They are not applying to the members of the public for a job. They're just organizations of private citizens who want to put their views out there. And so they don't have, there's no public trust with them. And the threat of corruption is certainly not the same. The threat of corruption is, if there is one, is extremely indirect, because it depends on the idea that a legislator or other office holder is going to do a favor for someone because they gave money to a completely separate, legally distinct organization that can't legally coordinate with that candidate to advocate issues that maybe help get that candidate elected. And of course, it could be for speaking on issues that have nothing to do with elections at all. So that threat of corruption isn't there.
David.
I would say that organizations that do have some obligation, even when they're private participants in the public debate, and that obligation is to be honest. They owe it to the public to be honest about both their motives and the reasons motivating their position. In order to evaluate those motives, we're entitled to know who they really are when they're making those arguments. If it's the tobacco companies arguing that smoking is healthy, I want to know that that's coming from the tobacco companies, and I think voters are entitled to that level of honesty and trust.
Next question.
Donna Rook, speaking of corruption, David, you mentioned the government needed to monitor this to prevent corruption. How about government corruption? In light of the IRS witch hunt against conservative organizations and also the Wisconsin John Doe witch hunt, where it's pretty clear that the Attorney General, had a bias against issue advocacy. That's what it was. And he deprived people of their right to representation, of property. So who polices the government?
Let me address your question, Donna. First, I think you've got your facts a little wrong. The fact of the matter is the Wisconsin prosecution was brought by a Republican prosecutor, not the Democratic Attorney General. And it was brought because the Walker campaign actually violated the law by coordinating their activities with organizations that were not supposed and not permitted to coordinate with a political candidate. That much has almost been admitted in the public by the Walkers, and that's why they've gone to the extraordinary lengths of trying to cut off that criminal investigation, which is being done by a nonpartisan group. So I think you've fallen victim a little bit to propaganda from the right on this, which is not accurate. Now, with respect to the IRS, the fact of the matter is the statute that the loophole that people rely upon in keeping identities of contributors to 501c4s and C6s secret, the statute actually says that those organizations have to devote or cannot devote a substantial part of their resources to political activities. We know from information that's out there that that is being violated. It was entirely appropriate for the IRS to investigate both groups on the left and the right violating that law and abusing the tax status that they were given, and that is in fact what was going on.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm not going to...
Hold on one second.
On the Wisconsin issue, I don't have time to get into the details, but I'd suggest that people just Google what happened there and read about the government raiding people's homes and taking their papers, and you can decide for yourself whether you think that's something that we want more of in this country as we have people policing people's political speech. As for the IRS issue, well, there might have been evidence relevant to that in some emails some people were interested in looking at, but unfortunately they're unavailable, so I can't tell you what they said.
David?
Yes, I think they should have been disclosed. Disclosure is a good thing.
It's a shame.
Next question, please.
David, I'm not going to tell you my name because I don't think it's your business.
That's okay as long as you aren't trying to make a substantial contribution to this debate.
This is from John Smith.
And the second, to go back to your analogy, didn't Dorothy figure out that the wizard was a charlatan without government regulation, and wasn't the real villain all along the Wicked Witch of the West?
Well, the problem is that the Wicked Witch was a real villain, but the problem with the wizard was not that, was that the wizard sent people out to risk their lives on a false premise, that he was a wizard and was telling them the right thing to do because he had wizard powers and would, what he was really doing was he was a charlatan trying to get them to risk their lives protecting his interests in destroying the witch. So, no, I don't think that that really supports your premise. I think it supports my premise that a person purporting to pretend to be a wizard should have to disclose his real identity at the time he's advising people to go out and risk their lives.
I'm going to take a second. You know, with the Fed coming on its 100th birthday, and all of us being in Chicago, isn't it time for the Union League Club to revisit the allegorical elements of the Wizard of Oz? I mean, aren't we all still talking about the very same topics that captivated Frank Baum up on the near north side? Brian Daley is just the guy to pull that together. All right, now back to the program. Jacob.
Well,
Did you like Dorothy, Toto? Who were you? Where did you come down?
I was going to say that's a good question. I'm glad he was here to ask it, because I don't remember the Wizard of Oz that well. I'm kind of focused on what's going on in the real world and don't frame my arguments around it. So thank you for that.
I would point out that even in the Bible, parables serve a very useful purpose, and I think that's true of this debate as well.
All right. Well, on which yellow brick road will we find our next questioner? I'm looking at my microphone, ladies. Here we go.
Hi, this is for Mr. Melton. You had mentioned that the state government was the bad guy and they were trying to stifle debate on the civil rights back in the Alabama versus NAACP. Do you find that happening now? Because I personally find it happening now, especially when that gentleman mentioned Mozilla Firefox person who just simply contributed to Proposition 8 in California, and he was, in fact, intimidated and told to basically sit up and shut down and lost his job.
Okay. Well, on the Mozilla situation, my understanding of the facts is he could have stayed in his job if he had been willing to fight and defend his position publicly. And I think that's something that we should require of our citizens in this country.
Yeah, I just find it troublesome and dangerous when we say that the government has the right to force.
The government didn't force him out of his job.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what's on the table right now. And that
Okay.
is that when we talk
In the
about the
Alabama
government
case-
forcing us to disclose, we should have the freedom to choose who we want to know what we...
In the Alabama case, my point about the government was this. The government on that side was trying to suppress speech. That is something that the First Amendment puts limits on. It prohibits the government from trying to suppress speech. And those are the same reasons that we encourage disclosure, so we can have a fully informed public debate.
All right. Jacob, anything on that one before we go to our next question?
No, that's all right.
No? Okay. Next, right down here. Okay, we're over here.
John Bowman. I'm on a board, and I also know other situations where anonymous donors to C3s make significant contributions just because they don't want other people asking them for money. That's one practical reason why I think I would draw a brighter line between C3s and C4s. And I might come out differently as to one or the other in that kind of circumstance. Can you talk about that a bit?
C3, the difference between contributing to C3s or contributing to C4s.
I can.
Because they don't want other people to solicit them for donations.
Well, that first part's a great point. Again, we have a right to privacy in general. The default assumptions in this country should be in favor of liberty and privacy, and the government should only be able to overcome those, especially when we're talking about political speech, when it has a really good reason. And the reasons just aren't there when you're talking about independent groups talking about the issues and not engaging in electioneering. And so, of course, that kind of information should be private for all kinds of reasons, for whatever reasons are important to you, including not being hit up by others for money, including not being harassed, including not having your nosy neighbors gossip about you. It's nobody's business, and that's a good enough reason to protect it.
I would say that the distinction that exists between C3s and C4s is appropriate. C3s, as part of the bargain, is that in exchange for getting a tax exemption as a charitable organization under C3, you have to agree not to engage in partisan activities. And that's why they are entitled to keep their donors secret. They do not have to disclose them. Now, C4s are advocacy organizations. They, by definition, seek to participate in and move the public opinion in debates. For that reason, they should have to disclose the identities of their donors to the extent they're engaged in that activity. If they want to engage in other activities like taking care of pets or engaging in other things that are non-political, they're entitled to do that with non-disclosed donor money, but they have to segregate those activities from their political activities.
So did I hear and understand correctly that you don't think 501c3s should have to disclose their donors?
501c3s have to disclose their donors to the government, but they do not have to publicly disclose their donors.
And you don't think they should have to?
I think that they are prohibited from engaging in partisan political activities. So it's a moot issue in the context of this debate.
But no, it's not, because earlier you said that people who engage in advocacy on issues to try to influence the public debate significantly should have to reveal their donors. And a 501c3 absolutely can do that. So where do you draw the line?
Actually, a 501c3 is prohibited by law from engaging in those activities, Jacob. That's a condition of receiving that tax exemption. Yes, it
maybe we're not clear
is. Check out the tax code.
A 501c3...
Certain percent, 20%. Yes. Yes.
Well, certainly a 501c3 organization like the Illinois Policy Institute can put its ideas on public policy out there as much as it wants. The amount that could be tied to the amount of lobbying it would do could be limited. The amount of, and at certain times, references to candidates are limited. But in general, they can advocate on policy to the public all that they want. And you're saying that, so should they have to disclose for that or not?
Yes, I would say would be a good idea for the IPI to disclose its substantial donors. ICPR, as a bipartisan organization, voluntarily does that when it files its 990 tax return. I think it would be appropriate for IPI to do the same, particularly since they have a budget that's something like 10 times the size of our budget. So we are at a bit of a disadvantage when we engage in these public debates.
You're at no disadvantage. You've got a great moderator. Come on. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, okay, here we go with you see a little debate broke out here, and so we missed our last question. This is our concluding question.
Sally Chavez.
Microphone?
I'm Sally Chavez. My question, I was curious. You were saying that nonprofits make political contributions to 5% of the political, the funding for political parties in 2012, but Mr. Melton was saying that it would be close to 50% in the next presidential election. Right. Is that due to the difference between 501c3s and C4s?
No, that is a result of the historical evolution of this. Super PACs did not come into being until 2010 under a couple of court decisions, and it took a couple extra years for lawyers to figure out the loophole on how you could collect unlimited amounts of political donations and not have to disclose your donors. That occurred roughly in 2012, and we had the creation of these 501c4 and C6 organizations trying to hide the identity of substantial political donors. So the extent to which that's occurring in the political system has been growing dramatically since 2012. And as I said, in this next presidential election, it's estimated that a very substantial portion of the money coming into support political campaigns, both in the form of independent expenditures and direct contributions, will come from people trying to hide their identities, particularly on the independent expenditure side, where under the current law, they're entitled to exploit a loophole to do that. I'd just like to add one thing. On the 501c3s, they actually are not permitted to engage at all in partisan political activities. What they are entitled to use 20% of their proceeds to do is for lobbying, but not for partisan political activities. So, just a clarification.
Yeah, no question about that.
All right, with that, we're getting to our closings. We start with the affirmative closing. So, David, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. I would say this: we have a system of self-governance. In that system, it is critical that voters have as much information as possible to make intelligent decisions in guiding our government and determining how we will collectively govern ourselves. That is why the First Amendment generally prohibits the government from trying to interfere with that flow of information or suppress speech. For that same reason, disclosure of people who seek to contribute substantial sums of money to affect government action, either through direct campaign contributions, through lobbying, or through independent expenditures, should have to disclose their true identities, so voters have sufficient information to effectively evaluate the credibility of those arguments and those positions when they are making decisions about their own self-governance. That is what the core of this argument is about today. Now, Is there a cost when you participate, when you decide to step into the ring and participate in a political debate? Can you be subject to criticism? Yes, you can. That's legal. You can't be subject to having your home bombed or having yourself put a physical threat. That is prohibited, and we have governments to enforce those prohibitions. But can you be subject to criticism sometimes for taking a political position? Sure. That's part of the price of being a democracy, of being a self-governing democracy. And when people want to try and move public policy in substantial ways, we're entitled to know what their motives are and what their true identities are. Thank you very much.
Well, the resolution in this debate and the position that Mr. Melton has advocated sweeps extremely broadly. It imposes a heavy burden on people who want to engage in any kind of political speech, not just speech about candidates, not just speech during an election, but anything to do with issues that affect the public. And that is incredible, and it's not something that we've seen in this country before. Political speech, the Supreme Court has held again and again, is the most important speech under the First Amendment. And the idea that we would burden people, make them pay a cost that the government decides who will pay it depending on how much of it you're doing, and on where they want to draw the lines, what counts as issue advocacy. We're going to make them pay a cost to be allowed to speak on issues of public importance. That is not part of this country's history, and that is not what people who want free and open debate should support. And the idea that any kind of speech on politics could corrupt or is somehow threatening is really contrary to the principles of the First Amendment. The idea that more speech is better. Mr. Melton says more information is better, more information that the government decides people should disclose. But the fact is that discouraging speech by imposing these costs will result in less speech. It will result in people dropping out of the political debate rather than exposing themselves to retaliation. That is not something that our First Amendment allows, and it's not something that we should want. We should want people to participate as much as possible in the way that they choose to participate, and for that reason, we should not force organizations that participate in debate on political issues to turn over the identities of their donors to the government.
Thank you very much. You have heard the advocates, you've heard the arguments, you've got your little clicker. I'm going to read the resolution to you another time, and you've got a couple of minutes to vote. Let me read the resolution. Nonprofit organizations influencing government and engaging in political advocacy, including issue advertising, should be required to disclose their donors. If you agree with that, please press 1A. If you vote against, please press 2B. If you're not sure, please press 3C. Agree, 1A. Oppose, 2B. Not sure, 3C. And you've got whatever you vote last, that's how you'll be recorded. And if there are empty spots next to you, you can vote those people for you. That's okay. Here, that's okay. Not over at the Board of Elections. You can't do that there.
You're right.
You can vote as many times as you want, but only your last vote will be counted. And these are anonymous. You know, ladies and gentlemen, we started off months and months ago talking about this topic, and we weren't sure how much people would want to hear about it or listen to a formal debate where two folks who have spent a lot of time researching the substance and the underlying subject matter would get together and be able to critique each other's positions as they went through the conversation. I think what we found out today is the organizations made great choices about the advocates to come sit before us, and the organizations were perspicacious with respect to their selection of the topic, because here we are in the midst of a summer with a lot of political conversation going on, including advertising. In this case, in the state of Illinois, we know that Governor Rauner is paying for some of these ads. But here in Illinois, you never maybe know everything about all of the ads. And so it's a topic that is of ongoing interest, I think, as is illustrated by this great turnout here today. Before we get the results, and I'm going to get a plus minus for early and late, is that right? In a minute or two? Let me tell you about my no, I'm going to. One more time for the advocates. I will say, while we're getting the tally, I really appreciated David's remarks at the beginning. It is a conversation here that's been going on 135 years. Our motto is eventually we'll get it right. But we do appreciate your interest, and we appreciate folks. If you're interested in things like this, we're probably interested in you, and we always have membership material on the way out. And so if you're interested, ask one of the members or pick up a packet, and we can go from there. All right. Now I'm going to decipher this. Hold on, Chris. Stay nearby. All right. On the first vote. Wait a minute. All right. On the first vote, for the motion, 40%. Against the motion, 38%. Unsure, 2%. No, 22%. 22%. On the second vote, the one we just took, for the motion, 48%. Against the motion, 49%. It was an eyelash. Unsure, 2. So support for the motion increased 8 points. Way to go, David. And opposition to the motion, Jacob, it increased 11 points. I think you're both winners. And so are we. Thanks so much for adjourning. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was great. Thank you, David. That was great. Thanks a lot. You got a good job. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
It's nice to get formal.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great job to you. And thanks. Laura, thank you. That was terrific. And you know, eventually the state of Illinois campaign finance law, which in their opinion restricts campaign contributions for all but a privileged few in Illinois. Jacob received his bachelor's from Grove City College, and like I say, his JD from the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Deborah Cook of the United States Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit, just one east of here, over in Columbus, Detroit, Cincinnati, places like that. And then he had his own law office in Ohio before coming out to Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome for Jacob Hubert, please. Now, we've got 3 chairs there. There'll be a little walking around, but let's do it this way. For the opening affirmative and negative, pro and contra, I'm going to ask the advocate to come up here to the lectern, and then I'll switch places with you. I'll come back up here, and then we'll do the rebuttals. How's that sound? Okay. All right, so this being a motion that is going to be supported by David Melton. David Melton, I'm going to read the motion one more time so everybody has it in mind. Nonprofit organizations influencing government and engaging in political advocacy, including issue advertising, should be required to disclose their donors. For the motion, David Melton.
Thank you, Chris. And just before I begin, let me thank the IPI for setting this debate up. We at ICPR always appreciate the opportunity to come and address audiences, whatever their political persuasion. We're bipartisan. And we look forward to an opportunity to try and convince you. So thanks to Chris and to IPI and to all of you for coming today. Why is it appropriate to require those trying to exert substantial influence on our government or our elected representatives to disclose their true identities? Well, this is not a hard issue. In fact, courts throughout our country's history have repeatedly said there are at least 3 fundamental reasons why government can require that the true identity of the donors or those seeking to influence the political process have to be disclosed. The first and the most important reason that we require the true identity of donors, substantial donors, to be disclosed is to provide voters with the necessary information about the source of those comments so that they can evaluate the credibility of those comments. Who is speaking can make a significant difference on the credibility of an argument. If we see an ad telling us that smoking is healthy, it helps to know whether that ad is financed by medical researchers or by the tobacco industry. Voters are entitled to that same type of information when they go to the polls and have to decide between competing policy proposals being urged by some of the most powerful and richest members of our society. Second fundamental reason that we require the disclosure of the true identities of people seeking to buy influence with our government is to prevent corruption. And we have a long history that we can draw on here. Human history has repeatedly demonstrated that power corrupts and that money corrupts. And within our own United States history, we have repeatedly found that there is a danger of corruption. That is why the founders of our nation put a clause in the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, prohibiting government officials from accepting gifts or other benefits from the leaders of foreign nations without disclosure to and the consent of Congress. That is why we adopted the initial campaign finance reforms at the turn of the century, including the Tillman Act prohibiting corporate contributions to political campaigns. That is why, in the wake of the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s, we strengthened those disclosure requirements under the federal laws. And that is why we strengthened those requirements, those disclosure requirements again in the 1970s, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, which, for those of you who are old enough to remember it, may recall that the plumbers who were engaged in the bugging operation were paid out of a secret slush fund maintained by the Nixon re-election campaign. So prevention of corruption is the second important reason that we require disclosure of the true identities of those seeking to influence our government. The third, and I would just say that here I want to remember and pay tribute to the
Good afternoon. If I could have your attention for just a moment, please. I know that you're all having lovely lunchtime conversations, but I must interrupt you. I want to tell you that Joel Quinville will be here shortly. I'm kidding, but I knew that would make the room quiet. Tomorrow at the Illinois Policy Institute, the entire staff will be showing up in their Blackhawks gear. And it turns out we're going to have some guests from Bulgaria, so I was trying to explain why that is, and it was all a little confusing last night at a dinner I was at. My name's John Tillman. I'm the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. I just wanted to briefly say thanks to all of you for being here for this important debate. And since all of you have already supposedly, or I assume rather, voted, and I do believe that 2 minutes have gone by and you are locked in, I would just like to say that my money's on Jacob Hubert. That was, you know, where's your opponent, Jacob? He's here somewhere. Oh, you're right there. There you are, sitting right next to me. I couldn't see you. Although I must say that you have had several people come up to you and giving you very fine words of encouragement, and you have advocates in the room, so I think the room will be very balanced in its point of view. For those of you who are here who had friends who want to be here, you can text them now and let them know that CAN TV is carrying this live. And if they want to, they can watch that now on their cable system, CAN TV 27. And they can go, of course, later on to cantv.org to watch this. If you have so much fun and you want to see it a second time, cantv.org for you. And then finally, I would just like to say thank you so much to the Union League Club, and especially David Cohn, who will be up here in a moment, who does just an amazing job in running the Public Affairs Committee of the Union League Club. Really the best in the country, I believe. I've been to many clubs all over the country. They usually try to block me at the front door, so I go in the side door, but I do get in. And normally, most of those clubs have nothing on par with what our great Union League Club does. I've been a member for many years, and it is just an enriching place with all points of view well represented. And David, you are really the leader of making that happen, and have been doing it so well for a very long time. So on behalf of all of us,
alludes quite directly to our faith in the Union and the importance of affiliating ourselves with those who believe in democracy and involvement by citizens thereof. And it is in that context that we gather here today. We have a full-time Public Affairs Committee that works on public policy issues, and we are delighted to partner with the Illinois Policy Institute and all of our civic affairs partners to talk about the issues that matter to us as citizens of this great nation. In keeping with our tradition here at the club, before I turn it over to our chairman, Mr. Roebling, can I ask you to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, the chairman of today's debate and a senior counsel of our Public Affairs Committee, Mr. Chris Roebling.
Thank you. All right. We've got terrific folks up here today for and against the motion. For the motion, David Melton is Executive Director of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. He was elected to the board of directors of that organization in May, but then he resigned that position in July of 2013 to assume the duties of executive director. Melton was an attorney in private practice, both with the Chicago firm Mayer Brown and the Milwaukee firm Foley and Lardner, and has extensive experience in intellectual property matters, and was part of the pro bono team of attorneys that sued the state of Illinois to compel compliance with federal statutes relating to what we call motor voter, the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act. Former board member, including a term as president of the board of the Chicago Council of Lawyers, please welcome David Melton. David, please come on up. And take your seat over here. Against the motion, Jacob Hubert from Jacob is a University of Chicago graduate, University of Chicago Law School graduate. He is a senior attorney at the Liberty Justice Center, the Illinois Policy Institute. He litigates cases to protect economic liberty, the First Amendment, and other constitutional rights in both federal and state forums. In his First Amendment practice, Jacob and the Liberty Justice Center are engaged in civic affairs in the city of Chicago. Thank you for doing that. So a round of applause for David and the Union League Club. And now I happily turn over the podium to Chris Roebling, who will be your moderator, and I will resume my seat as a friendly heckler. Oh, I'm sorry, I meant David Cohn.
John, thank you very much for those gracious comments. We are delighted to welcome everyone here to the Union League Club of Chicago on behalf of the officers, directors, and members of the club, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging two of our senior officers who are with us today. Our first Vice President, Mr. Terry Hendrickson. Mr. Hendrickson, thank you. And our second Vice President, Mr. William Nissen. Mr. Nissen. And Mr. Nissen concurrently chairs the Public Affairs Committee this year. As John mentioned, we are delighted to be partnering with the Illinois Policy Institute. We want to thank the Illinois Policy Institute for not only bringing us this substantive program, but for graciously providing luncheon service for all of us today. So thank you very much, John. We really appreciate that. And since this is an Oxford-style debate, Mr. Roebling is actually our chairman, and he will be engaging our two presenters today in discussion of the motion before us, resolved: any United States city that wishes to have an NHL franchise must endure winter. Thank you. No, in all seriousness, we appreciate the opportunity to gather today in the greatest tradition of Western democracy in our democratic republic to reason together and to discuss this important question by hearing from these two gentlemen who will argue for and against the motion before us. Briefly, I just wanted to mention that the reason the Union League Club is involved in such matters goes back to our founding. This is the only private club in the United States with an institutional commitment to public policy and civic affairs. And the reason for that is that this club was founded by citizen patriots who during the Civil War formed an organization that was called the Union Leagues of America. It was formed in 1862 during the height of the Civil War to assist President Lincoln in defense of the Union. That's where the Union and the Union League Club name comes from. And this wonderful portrait above the mantelpiece that you see, Patria, which is emblematic of our devotion to country,